The shadow on the stairs. The dead don't move like the living. That's how I knew, on that first night, that what I saw on my grandmother's staircase wasn't human. I should have left right then, packed whatever I could fit in my car and never looked back. But some morbid curiosity kept me there. Or maybe it was something else. Something I couldn't understand until it was too late. My name is Michael Harmon. I'm 34 years old, and until 4 months ago, I was a perfectly rational man who didn't believe in ghosts. Now, I'm not sure what I believe anymore. What I'm about to tell you happened exactly as I remember it. I've documented everything, kept journals, taken photos, and even attempted recordings, though those never quite worked out the way I expected. This isn't a ghost story. This is my life. It started when my marriage collapsed last spring. 8 years together, gone in the space of a text message. I can't do this anymore. I'm staying at David's. David, my college roommate. The best man at our wedding. The betrayal was so complete that I couldn't bear to stay in Portland, surrounded by memories and mutual friends who didn't know which side to take. When my father called to tell me that my grandmother's house was just sitting empty in my hometown of Maplewood, it seemed like fate. The old Victorian had been in our family for generations. After Grandma Ruth died 2 years ago, no one had the heart to sell it, but no one wanted to live there either. The place had been gathering dust since her funeral. "You could get a fresh start," Dad suggested, his voice crackling over the phone. "Property values are up in that neighborhood. You'd be doing us a favor, keeping the place from deteriorating." There was something in his tone I couldn't quite place. Hesitancy? Relief that someone else would take on the burden? At the time, I was too absorbed in my own problems to give it much thought. "I'll think about it," I said, but I'd already made up my mind. The hospital in Maplewood was desperate for security staff, and my experience as a security supervisor in Portland made me an attractive candidate. Within 3 weeks, I had packed up my half of what had once been a shared life, accepted a position on the night shift, and moved back to the town I'd left 15 years before. Grandma Ruth's house stood at the end of Sycamore Street, partially hidden behind a row of ancient oak trees. 3 stories of faded yellow Victorian charm, with a wraparound porch and gingerbread trim that had seen better days. I remembered visiting as a child, awed by its size compared to our suburban ranch house. The interior featured dark wood paneling, stained glass accents, and a narrow staircase that wound up through the center of the house like a spine. The first few weeks were uneventful. I worked the 6 p.m. to 2 a.m. shift at the hospital, came home to an empty house, slept until mid-morning, and spent my days renovating. I stripped wallpaper, sanded floors, and repainted rooms, grateful for the physical labor that left me too exhausted to dwell on my failed marriage. The house was large for one person, with 4 bedrooms on the 2nd floor and an attic space that ran the length of the 3rd. I chose the main bedroom at the front of the house, the one that had been my grandparents'. The others I closed off, telling myself I'd deal with them when I had more energy. The truth was, those empty rooms depressed me, reminding me of the family I'd planned to have. Then came that first night in early October. I remember it clearly because we'd had a chaotic shift at the hospital. A car accident had brought in 6 trauma patients simultaneously, and one of them had become violent in the ER, requiring security intervention. I'd taken an elbow to the ribs during the scuffle, and my supervisor insisted I file an incident report before leaving, which kept me later than usual. I pulled into my driveway at 2:15 a.m., bone-tired and sore. The old house loomed against the night sky, all its windows dark except for the porch light I'd left on. A thin mist had settled over Maplewood, diffusing the streetlights into hazy orbs. The neighborhood was utterly silent. No cars, no barking dogs, not even the rustle of wind in the trees. I unlocked the front door, stepped inside, and flicked on the entry light. The hall illuminated dimly under the antique fixture, shadows pooling in the corners. I hung my jacket on the coat rack, massaging my bruised ribs, when something caught my eye, movement on the staircase. I froze, keys still in hand. In the middle of the stairs, a dark figure glided slowly across the steps. Not walking, gliding as if the feet never quite touched the wood. It was tall and thin, more of a silhouette than a solid form, and it moved with a terrible grace that made my skin crawl. Hello? My voice came out embarrassingly high. Is someone there? No response. The figure continued its silent journey across the stairs, then faded into the shadows of the upper landing. My heart hammered against my ribs. I fumbled for my phone, turning on its flashlight and shining it up the stairwell. Nothing. This is private property, I called out, trying to sound authoritative despite my fear. I'm giving you one chance to show yourself before I call the police. Silence answered me. The staircase remained empty. I spent the next hour systematically searching every room in the house, flipping on lights, checking closets, looking under beds. I found no sign of intrusion, all windows locked, all doors secure. In the light of my thorough inspection, I began to doubt what I'd seen. It had been a long day. I was exhausted. The play of shadows, the old house settling, my overtired brain, any of these could explain what I thought I'd witnessed. I finally fell into bed around 3:30 a.m., convincing myself it had been nothing. But as I drifted towards sleep, a persistent thought nagged at me. If it had been just a shadow, why had it moved with such purpose? And why had it filled me with such profound, inexplicable dread? I awoke the next morning to sunlight streaming through the curtains, the events of the night before seeming distant and ridiculous. I spent the day patching cracks in the dining room ceiling, then went to work as usual. By the time my shift ended, I had almost forgotten about the shadow on the stairs. Almost. As I drove home that night, a sense of unease grew with each mile. I found myself watching the clock on my dashboard. 1:58 a.m., 2:05 a.m., 2:12 a.m. I pulled into my driveway at exactly 2:16. Inside, I didn't bother being quiet. I flipped on every light switch I passed, whistling tunelessly as I moved through the entry hall. See? Nothing to worry about. Just an old house and an overactive imagination. Then I checked my watch. 2:17 a.m. A movement caught my eye. There it was again, the shadow, sliding across the middle of the staircase. This time, I stood perfectly still and watched. The figure was clearer tonight. The suggestion of old-fashioned clothes, perhaps a long coat or dress. It paused halfway across, turning slightly as if looking toward the window on the landing, then continued its silent journey until it disappeared into the darkness of the upper hall. I felt the blood drain from my face. This was no trick of the light, no hallucination born of exhaustion. Something was in my house. My hand shook as I reached for my phone, but I stopped before dialing. What would I tell the police? That I'd seen a shadow? That my house might be haunted? They'd think I was drunk or high or simply wasting their time. Instead, I grabbed a baseball bat from the closet and forced myself to climb those stairs, switching on lights as I went. Again, I searched every room, every closet, every possible hiding place. Again, I found nothing. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in the living room with all the lights on, the baseball bat across my knees, waiting for morning. As sunlight gradually filled the room, I began researching security systems on my laptop. By noon, I had scheduled an installation for the following day. Cameras covering every entrance, motion sensors, the works. But even as I confirmed the appointment, a voice in the back of my mind whispered that no security system would keep out what had visited my staircase. Because deep down, I already suspected that whatever I'd seen wasn't an intruder. It was something else entirely. The security company came and went. The system was state-of-the-art, with cameras that uploaded footage directly to cloud storage I could access from my phone. I set up additional cameras on the staircase, positioned to capture any movement from multiple angles. That night, I went to work feeling better, more in control. At the hospital, I mentioned nothing about what I'd been experiencing. What was there to say? Instead, I threw myself into my duties, volunteering to handle a series of patient complaints that had been piling up. Anything to keep busy, to keep from thinking about what might be waiting for me at home. My shift ended at 2:05 a.m. I sat in my car in the hospital parking lot, watching the dashboard clock, heart pounding as the minutes ticked by. At 2:10, I started the engine. I could be home by 2:17. I could see for myself whether the shadow would appear again, right on schedule. Instead, I drove to an all-night diner and sat there until sunrise, nursing cup after cup of bitter coffee. The waitress gave me strange looks but asked no questions. When daylight came, I drove home, climbed the stairs without incident, and collapsed into bed. That afternoon, I reviewed the security footage from the night before. The cameras had functioned perfectly, recording hours of absolutely nothing. The staircase remained empty all night. No shadows, no movement, no sign that anything unusual had occurred at 2:17 a.m. or any other time. I told myself this was good news. Whatever I'd seen on those previous nights had been in my head: stress, exhaustion, the emotional aftermath of my divorce. I convinced myself so thoroughly that I went home directly after my shift that night, arriving at 2:14 a.m. I unlocked the door, hung up my jacket, and waited. 2:17 a.m. came, and with it, the shadow. It appeared precisely as before, gliding across the middle section of the staircase with that same unnatural grace. This time, I forced myself to really look at it. The figure was tall and thin, possibly female based on what seemed to be the outline of a long skirt. It moved with its head slightly bowed, hands, if it had hands, hidden within its form. As it reached the point where the stairs turned toward the upper landing, it paused and seemed to look directly at me. I felt a cold dread wash over me, like ice water running down my spine. The temperature in the hallway plummeted. I could see my breath fogging in the air. For several heartbeats, we regarded each other, me frozen in place by the door and this thing watching me from the stairs. Then it continued on its way, disappearing into the shadows. My hands trembled as I pulled out my phone and checked the security app. The camera footage showed an empty staircase. According to the indisputable electronic record, nothing had crossed those stairs. But I knew what I had seen, and somehow the shadow knew I had seen it too. That night marked the beginning of what I can only describe as a haunting. Each night, at exactly 2:17 a.m., the shadow appeared on my staircase. Sometimes I was there to witness it, sometimes I stayed away, but the pattern never varied. When I did watch, I noticed the shadow's behavior becoming more deliberate. Not just crossing the stairs, but pausing, looking around, sometimes lingering at the window on the landing as if searching for something outside. I began keeping a journal, documenting each appearance in meticulous detail. I tried photographing the phenomenon with my phone, but the shadow never appeared in images. I attempted video recordings, voice recordings, even brought home an infrared thermometer from the hospital to measure the temperature drops. The thermometer confirmed what I felt. The temperature would fall by 15 degrees during the shadow's appearance, but none of my other documentation methods captured anything unusual. Sleep became a luxury I could rarely afford. When I did manage to drift off, my dreams were filled with a young woman's voice calling for help, though I could never make out the words. I would wake gasping, convinced someone was in the room with me, only to find myself alone. 3 weeks into this nightmare, I realized I couldn't continue without answers. If I was losing my mind, I needed to know. And if I wasn't, if something truly supernatural was happening in my house, I needed to understand why. So I called my father. "Dad," I said when he answered, trying to keep my voice casual, "do you know anything about the history of Grandma's house? Anything unusual that might have happened there?" A long silence followed, so extended that I checked to see if the call had dropped. "Why do you ask?" he finally replied, his tone suddenly guarded. "Just curious. I've been doing some renovations, and I wondered about the original owners, family stories, that kind of thing." Another pause. "Michael, if you're having second thoughts about living there, it's fine. We can put the house on the market. Property values in that neighborhood are—" "I'm not looking to sell," I interrupted. "I just want to know about the house's history." "There's nothing to know." His response came too quickly. "It's just an old house that's been in the family for generations. Listen, I've got to go. Your mother's waiting for me to take her shopping." He hung up before I could press further. That conversation confirmed what I had begun to suspect. There was something about this house, something my family didn't talk about. And somehow, that something was connected to the shadow that visited my staircase every night at 2:17 a.m. The next day, instead of sleeping, I drove to the Maplewood Historical Society. The building was small but well-maintained, with an elderly volunteer at the front desk who perked up at the sight of a visitor. "I'm researching the history of my house," I explained. "It's the Victorian on Sycamore Street, the Harmon House." The woman's smile faltered just slightly. Oh yes, the old Dr. Harmon place. Such a beautiful home. Are you family? Yes, I'm Michael Harmon. Dr. Harmon would have been my great-great-grandfather, I believe. She nodded, but something in her expression had changed. What kind of information are you looking for specifically? Anything, really. Newspaper articles, photographs, records from when the house was built. She disappeared into a back room and returned with several folders and a large book that appeared to be a town history. These might help you get started. The microfilm archives are through that door if you want to look at old newspapers. I spent hours going through everything I could find. Dr. William Harmon, my great-great-grandfather, had built the house in 1891. He'd been a prominent physician in town, married to Elizabeth Harmon, with whom he had 3 children, 2 sons, Edward and James, and a daughter, Margaret. Edward was my great-grandfather, the line from which I descended. James had moved west during the gold rush and was rarely mentioned afterward. Margaret appeared in family photographs until about 1912, then vanished from the record. One newspaper clipping from 1913 caught my attention. A brief mention of a regrettable incident at the Harmon residence that had cast a pall over Maplewood society. No details were provided, just vague references to the family's withdrawal from public life for a period afterward. As I was preparing to leave, the elderly volunteer approached my table. "Did you find what you were looking for?" she asked, gathering the materials I'd finished with. "Not exactly," I admitted. "There seems to be some mystery surrounding my great-great-aunt Margaret. Do you know anything about her?" The woman glanced around as if to ensure no one else was listening, though we were alone in the small archive room. "It wasn't something people talked about," she said quietly. "My grandmother knew the family. All she would ever say was that it was a tragedy and that the Harmons weren't the same afterward." "What kind of tragedy?" She shook her head. "Grandmother wouldn't say, just that it involved the daughter Margaret, and that afterward, Dr. Harmon became obsessed with controlling his sons' lives, especially who they married." She hesitated, then added, "If you really want to know more, you might check the attic of that old house. People kept everything in those days." I thanked her and left, my mind racing with possibilities. The timing couldn't be coincidental. Margaret's disappearance from records around 1913, the regrettable incident, and now a shadow that seemed to be searching for something on my stairs. When I got home, exhaustion finally caught up with me. I collapsed into bed and fell into a deep sleep filled with fragmented dreams. A young woman crying, an angry man's voice, the sound of something heavy being dragged across wooden floors. I awoke to darkness, momentarily disoriented. The bedside clock read 1:56 a.m. Without thinking, I got up and walked to the staircase, as if pulled by an invisible thread. Standing at the top of the stairs, I waited. At precisely 2:17 a.m., the shadow appeared, but this time, it didn't cross the staircase. Instead, it turned and looked up at me. We regarded each other in silence, separated by more than a century of time, connected by something I couldn't yet understand. The shadow raised what appeared to be an arm, pointing upward toward the attic. Then it faded away, leaving me alone in the darkened house, with the certainty that whatever answers I sought were waiting above me. Tomorrow, I decided, I would search the attic. Whatever secrets the house held, whatever tragedy had befallen Margaret Harmon in 1913, I would find the truth. Because now I understood that the shadow wasn't just a random haunting, it was trying to tell me something, and I was finally ready to listen. Morning came with a watery autumn sunlight that did little to dispel the chill I'd felt since my encounter on the stairs. I called in sick to work for the first time since starting at the hospital. Whatever waited for me in the attic couldn't wait another day. The pull-down ladder to the attic creaked in protest as I lowered it from the ceiling of the second-floor hallway. Dust rained down, making me cough. I grabbed a flashlight, a bottle of water, and my phone, then climbed up into the darkness. The attic ran the entire length of the house, with dormered windows at each end letting in thin shafts of light that illuminated swirling dust motes. The space was cluttered with the accumulated possessions of generations, furniture draped in yellowed sheets, stacks of cardboard boxes, old trunks with tarnished brass fittings. The air smelled of mothballs and old paper, that distinctive scent of forgotten things. I stood for a moment, overwhelmed by the task ahead. Where would I even begin? The shadow had pointed up, but not to any specific location. This could take days. "All right, Margaret," I said aloud, surprising myself. "If you're here, maybe you could give me another hint." Only silence answered me. I felt foolish, but also strangely certain that I was on the right track. I decided to work methodically, starting from the front of the house and moving toward the back, examining everything I found. The first few hours yielded nothing of interest. Holiday decorations, outdated clothing, my father's college textbooks. I found family photo albums from the 1960s and 70s, which I set aside to look through later, but nothing from the early 1900s when Margaret would have lived in the house. By midday, I had worked my way to the center of the attic, where the ceiling peaked. A child's rocking horse sat forlornly in a shaft of sunlight, its painted smile eerie in the dim light. Beyond it stood an ancient roll-top desk, its surface gray with dust except for what looked like finger marks, as if someone had recently touched it. I approached cautiously, playing my flashlight over the desk. The tracks in the dust were distinct, 4 parallel lines as if someone had dragged their fingers across the surface. But there were no footprints in the thick dust on the floor around it. No one had walked here in years. A chill ran through me. I glanced behind me, half expecting to see the shadow even in daylight, but I was alone. The desk was locked, but the key sat in the keyhole, tarnished with age. I turned it, hearing the mechanism click, and rolled up the wooden timbre. Inside, the cubbyhole compartments were stuffed with papers, bills, receipts, letters, all from the 1940s and 50s. Nothing that would help me understand Margaret or the shadow. I was about to close it when I noticed something odd about the desk's construction. The bottom of the central drawer seemed too shallow compared to its exterior dimensions. I pulled it out completely and examined it under the flashlight. Sure enough, there was a false bottom, a thin piece of wood that slid aside to reveal a hidden compartment. My heart raced as I carefully removed the false bottom. Inside the secret space lay a small leather-bound book, its cover cracked with age, and a velvet pouch tied with a faded ribbon. I opened the book first. On the inside cover, written in a delicate hand, were the words, "Eleanor Harmon, 1910. Eleanor, that would be Edward's wife, my great-grandmother. The first entry was dated April 17th, 1910. Edward has brought me to his family home at last. It is grander than I expected, though there is a heaviness to the atmosphere I cannot quite explain. His father, the doctor, watches me with such intensity it makes me uncomfortable. His mother is kind but distant. Margaret, Edward's sister, is the only one who seems truly pleased by our arrival. She is 22, only a year younger than myself, and I hope we shall become friends." I flipped through the pages, scanning entries about Eleanor's adjustment to life as a new bride in the Harmon household. Most were mundane observations about housekeeping, social calls, and relationships with the in-laws. But as the dates moved into 1912, the tone changed. June 2nd, 1912, I am increasingly concerned about Margaret. She has been secretive of late, disappearing for hours without explanation. When questioned by her father, she becomes defensive. There is tension at every meal. Edward says to pay it no mind, that Margaret has always been strong-willed, but I sense something more is happening. July 14th, 1912. Today I discovered Margaret's secret. I followed her on one of her afternoon walks and saw her meet a young man by the creek that runs behind the lumber mill. They embraced in a manner that left no doubt as to the nature of their relationship. I recognized him as Thomas Caldwell, son of the mill owner. The Caldwells are Irish Catholics, which explains the secrecy Dr. Harmon would never approve. I have not revealed what I saw, but my heart aches for Margaret, the look of joy on her face when she was with him. I have not seen her so animated within these walls. The entries continued, describing how the relationship between Margaret and Thomas developed over the summer and fall of 1912, all without her family's knowledge. Eleanor had become Margaret's confidant, keeping her secret even from her husband. November 30th, 1912, disaster. Dr. Harmon intercepted a letter from Thomas to Margaret. The scene that followed was terrible. I have never seen such rage. He forbade Margaret from ever seeing that Irish papist again, threatened to disown her, to send her away. Margaret defied him openly, declared her love for Thomas, said they planned to marry. Dr. Harmon struck her across the face. Edward pulled his father away, but the damage was done. Margaret has locked herself in her room and refuses to come out. I hear her weeping through the wall. My hands trembled as I turned the pages. The story unfolding in Eleanor's neat handwriting was so familiar, a tale of forbidden love, of patriarchal control. But what did it have to do with the shadow on my stairs? December 18th, 1912, Margaret came to me in terrible distress today. She is with child. Thomas knows nothing of it yet. She has been prevented from contacting him by her father's constant vigilance. She begged me to get a message to Thomas. I agreed. God forgive me for going against my husband's family, but I cannot bear to see her suffer so. December 24th, 1912. My message never reached Thomas. Dr. Harmon has somehow arranged for him to be sent to his family's timber interests in Oregon. Margaret is devastated. Dr. Harmon has decreed that she will be confined to the house until her condition is resolved. No one in town is to know of her disgrace. Mrs. Harmon weeps constantly, but offers no resistance to her husband's will. Edward is torn between loyalty to his father and concern for his sister. I alone seem to see the cruelty of it all. The next few entries detailed Margaret's increasing desperation as her pregnancy progressed. She was essentially a prisoner in the house, allowed to leave her room only for meals. Dr. Harmon spread a story in town that Margaret had gone to stay with relatives in Boston. Meanwhile, Eleanor tried repeatedly to get messages to Thomas in Oregon, but all were intercepted. March 17, 1913. Margaret grows more despondent by the day. Her health suffers, she barely eats. Most concerning are her nighttime wanderings. Twice this week I have found her on the stairs at odd hours, looking out the window toward town, as if expecting Thomas to appear. Last night I found her there at 17 minutes past 2, staring out with such longing it broke my heart. When I tried to lead her back to bed, she told me she heard her baby crying, though of course that's impossible. The child isn't due for another month at least. I checked my watch, the hairs on my arms rising. 17 minutes past 2, 2:17 a.m., the exact time the shadow appeared on my stairs each night. This couldn't be coincidence. April 10, 1913. Margaret's baby arrived today, a month early. A little girl with a dusting of dark hair like her father's. Dr. Harmon allowed me to assist with the birth, but has already arranged for the child to be taken away at first light. A couple in the next county who recently lost an infant will claim it as their own. Margaret knows nothing of this plan. She believes she will be permitted to keep her daughter. I cannot bear to tell her the truth. Dr. Harmon says once the child is gone, Margaret will be sent to a sanitarium in Vermont to recover her senses. This deception is unbearable, but I am powerless against the doctor's will. April 11th, 1913. I have done something unforgivable. When they took the baby from Margaret's room this morning, her screams were such that they will haunt me until my dying day. She fought Dr. Harmon with a strength I wouldn't have believed possible in her weakened state. It took both him and Edward to restrain her. When they brought in Dr. Foster to sedate her, I slipped away and wrote to Thomas Caldwell, telling him everything. May God forgive me if this brings more pain, but I could not let this injustice stand unanswered. The diary entries became more sporadic after that, as if Eleanor had become afraid of committing her thoughts to paper. There were weeks between entries, with only brief notes about Margaret being kept in her room, sedated much of the time, while the family waited for arrangements to be completed for the sanitarium. Then came an entry dated May 2nd, 1913, the handwriting noticeably shaky. Tragedy has struck our household. I cannot write the details, for they are too terrible to bear remembering. Margaret is gone from us. Dr. Harmon insists it was the childbed fever that took her, a delayed reaction. He has already seen to the death certificate. There will be no funeral, no announcement. She will be buried in the family plot behind the house with only the minister present. I alone know it was not fever that took her life, but I will carry that secret to my grave. May 3rd, 1913, Thomas Caldwell arrived today, demanding to see Margaret. His confrontation with Dr. Harmon was awful. The doctor refused to admit Margaret had even been in the house, claimed she was still in Boston. When Thomas became insistent, Edward and Dr. Foster removed him from the property. I watched from the window, my heart breaking for him. Later, I saw him standing across the street, staring up at the house. I believe he knows the truth, or suspects it. I fear what he might do. The final entry was dated May 7, 1913. Thomas Caldwell was found dead in the river this morning. They are calling it an accident, saying he must have fallen from the bridge in the dark. No one mentions that the bridge has railings 4 feet high. No one asks why he would have been on the bridge at night. Dr. Harmon received the news with a cold satisfaction that chilled my blood. I can stay in this house no longer. I have told Edward we must leave Maplewood, make a fresh start elsewhere. To my surprise, he agreed immediately. We will go to his uncle's place in Pennsylvania until we can establish ourselves. I will never speak of what happened here, but neither will I forget. May God have mercy on all our souls, and may Margaret and Thomas find in death the peace together they were denied in life. The diary ended there. I sat back on my heels, my mind reeling with what I'd read. The shadow on my stairs wasn't just any ghost. It was Margaret, still searching for her lover and her child after more than 100 years. I remembered the velvet pouch I'd found with the diary and reached for it with trembling hands. Inside was a locket on a delicate gold chain. When I opened it, I found a tiny photograph of a young woman with dark hair and serious eyes that seemed somehow familiar. On the other side was a lock of dark hair tied with thread, a baby's hair. As I held the locket, the attic suddenly felt colder. I glanced toward the stairs and froze. In the shadows cast by the midday sun, I could just make out a figure watching me. The same figure I'd seen on the stairs, but fainter, less distinct in daylight. It lingered for only a moment before dissolving back into darkness. A floorboard creaked beneath my knees, reminding me where I was. I looked down and noticed something odd. The board I was kneeling on didn't quite match the others. The wood was slightly newer, the nails less rusted. Curious, I tapped on it with my knuckles and heard a hollow sound. Using a screwdriver I found among the tools scattered in the attic, I pried up the board. Beneath it was a space between the joists, and in that space, wrapped in what had once been a white christening gown now yellowed with age, lay a bundle of small bones. I scrambled backward in horror, nearly falling down the attic stairs in my haste to get away. My hand clutched the locket so tightly the edges cut into my palm. It took several deep breaths before I could think clearly again. The baby. It had to be. Not taken to another family as Eleanor had been told, but hidden here, in the attic. Had Margaret discovered this? Was that why she... No, I couldn't jump to conclusions. I needed to be methodical, to understand exactly what had happened in this house. I carefully replaced the floorboard, marking its location in my mind, and gathered Eleanor's diary and the locket. As I descended the attic stairs, I felt a weight settling on me, the weight of a family secret buried for generations. Whatever had happened to Margaret and her baby, I was now part of it, and I wouldn't rest until I uncovered the full truth. I spent the remainder of the day combing through online genealogy databases, local history forums, and newspaper archives for any mention of the Harmon and Caldwell families. The official record was sparse. Margaret's death was indeed attributed to complications from childbed fever, with no mention of a baby. Thomas Caldwell's drowning was ruled accidental. Dr. William Harmon continued his medical practice until his death in 1920, respected and mourned by the community. No one ever connected the two deaths or questioned the official narrative. As night fell, I found myself drawn back to the staircase. The diary had mentioned Margaret looking out the window on the landing, watching for Thomas. I sat on that landing now, the locket in my palm, waiting for 2:17 a.m. Right on schedule, the shadow appeared. This time, instead of fear, I felt a profound sadness. The ghost paused in its usual spot, but instead of moving on, it lingered, seeming to grow more substantial by the moment. I could make out details I hadn't noticed before. A high-necked dress, hair piled on top of her head in the fashion of the early 1900s, hands clasped before her as if in supplication. "Margaret," I said softly, "I know what happened to you." The shadow turned toward me, and though it had no discernible face, I felt its attention like a physical touch. I found Eleanor's diary, I continued, holding up the small book. And I know about your baby. The temperature plummeted. My breath clouded in front of me. The shadow drifted closer, stopping just a few feet away. I held out the locket. This was yours, wasn't it? With a lock of your daughter's hair. The shadow reached out, its ephemeral hand passing through the locket without touching it. A sound like distant weeping filled the stairwell. I want to help you, I said, surprised to find I meant it. I want to make this right. Whatever that means, tell me what you need. The shadow's form wavered, then solidified again. It pointed, not up toward the attic this time, but down toward the basement. The basement? I asked. There's something else down there? The shadow nodded, a barely perceptible movement, and then faded away, leaving me alone on the cold landing. I didn't wait until morning. With flashlight in hand, I descended to the first floor, then continued down the narrow stairs to the basement. Unlike the rest of the house, which I'd been gradually renovating, the basement remained untouched. A damp, cobwebbed space with rough stone walls and a dirt floor in some areas. It had been partially finished at some point, with concrete poured over sections of the floor and some walls covered with crumbling plaster. I played my flashlight around, looking for anything unusual. The beam caught something glinting in the far corner, a metal handle protruding from what looked like a small door set into the wall, almost hidden behind an old coal bin. My heart racing, I made my way across the basement, pushing aside decades of accumulated junk. The door was small, maybe 3 feet square, sealed shut with what looked like multiple layers of paint. I used a discarded garden trowel to chip away at the paint, gradually exposing the outline of the door. It took nearly an hour of work before I could wrench it open. The hinges screamed in protest, dust billowing out as stale air rushed past me. I shined my flashlight into the space revealed, a small room, not much bigger than a closet, with a dirt floor and brick walls. At first, it appeared empty. Then my light caught something protruding from the dirt floor, the corner of what looked like a wooden box. I dropped to my knees and began digging with the trowel, the work becoming more frantic as more of the box emerged. Finally, I pulled it free. A wooden document box, its brass fittings green with age. Unlike everything else in the space, it showed signs of deliberate burial, not just abandonment. Someone had wanted this box hidden. The lock was rusted, but gave way easily when I applied pressure. Inside, I found a stack of letters tied with a faded blue ribbon, a man's pocket watch, and what appeared to be a marriage certificate, folded and yellowed with age. I opened the certificate first, my hands shaking. It was dated November 15th, 1912, a marriage between Margaret Elizabeth Harmon and Thomas Patrick Caldwell, performed by a justice of the peace in the neighboring county of Westmoreland. They had married in secret months before her father discovered their relationship. The letters were from Thomas to Margaret, spanning from summer 1912 to April 1913. The early ones were full of love and plans for their future. The later ones showed increasing concern as Margaret's replies apparently became less frequent, though her letters weren't in the box, only his. The final letter was dated April 15th, 1913. My dearest Margaret, I received the most disturbing letter yesterday from your sister-in-law, Eleanor. She claims you have given birth to our child and that your father has taken the baby away against your will. I cannot believe such cruelty could exist in this world. I am returning to Maplewood immediately to claim both you and our child. We will go west, start anew where your father's influence cannot reach us. I pray this letter reaches you. Eleanor warns that your father intercepts your mail, so I am sending this through her cousin in town, who has agreed to deliver it directly to the house when your father is at his practice. Hold fast, my love. By the time you read this, I will already be on my way to you. 3 days hence, I will come for you at night to avoid detection. Watch for me at the large oak tree across from your house at midnight. You are my wife in the eyes of God and the law. No one can keep us apart, not even your father. All my love, Thomas. I sat back on my heels, the pieces falling into place. Thomas had never made his midnight rendezvous with Margaret. According to Eleanor's diary, he had come to the house directly and confronted Dr. Harmon instead, perhaps not trusting that his letter would reach Margaret, or perhaps unable to wait until the appointed time. But why was this box buried in the basement? And what did it have to do with the shadow's appearance on the stairs at 2:17 a.m.? The pocket watch provided the final clue. When I opened it, I found the hands frozen at 2:17. An inscription inside the case read, "To Thomas, with all my heart, M.H." A gift from Margaret to Thomas. A watch that stopped at the exact time her ghost appeared on my stairs each night. I gathered everything and returned upstairs, my mind racing. The facts as I understood them painted a grim picture. Margaret and Thomas had married in secret. When her pregnancy was discovered, her father had kept her prisoner in the house, away from her husband. After she gave birth, the baby was taken from her, not given to another family as Eleanor believed, but hidden in the attic, where it presumably died. Margaret, discovering this, had taken her own life, though how wasn't clear from Eleanor's diary. Thomas, coming to rescue her, instead learned of her death. He confronted Dr. Harmon, was removed from the property, but continued to watch the house. Days later, he was found drowned in the river, an accident that Eleanor clearly believed was actually murder. But there were still gaps in the story. How had Margaret died exactly? How had the baby ended up hidden in the attic? And why did Margaret's spirit appear at exactly 2:17 each night? I laid the evidence out on my dining room table: Eleanor's diary, the locket, the marriage certificate, Thomas's letters, and the pocket watch. As I studied them, a chill draft swept through the room, rustling the papers. I looked up to find the shadow standing in the doorway. In daylight, the apparition had been faint, barely visible. At night, in the dimly lit room, it was more substantial than I'd ever seen it. A dark silhouette with definite form, the outline of a woman in early 20th century dress. She remained in the doorway as if waiting for permission to enter. "Come in," I said softly. "These belonged to you, didn't they?" The shadow glided forward, stopping at the edge of the table. One insubstantial hand reached out, hovering over the items spread before me. "Your father took your baby," I said, piecing it together aloud. "But he didn't give her to another family like Eleanor thought. He kept her here, hidden in the attic." I swallowed hard, forcing myself to continue. "She died there, didn't she? And when you found out..." The shadow's form flickered, distorting with what I interpreted as agitation or distress. It pointed to Eleanor's diary, then to itself, then made a motion like writing. "You want to tell your side," I realized. "Your story, not just Eleanor's version of events." The shadow nodded, then pointed to my laptop sitting on the coffee table in the living room. "You want me to type for you?" I asked, incredulous. Another nod. I fetched the laptop and opened a blank document. "I don't know if this will work, but I'm willing to try." The shadow moved to stand behind me, its cold presence making my skin prickle. I placed my hands on the keyboard, not sure what to expect. Should I just start typing questions and you can somehow... Before I could finish, an icy sensation enveloped my hands. They grew numb, heavy, and then, to my absolute horror and fascination, began moving on their own, striking keys without my conscious direction. My name was Margaret Elizabeth Harmon Caldwell. I was born in this house on June 12, 1890, and I died here on May 1, 1913. This is my true account of what happened. I watched, astonished, as words appeared on the screen seemingly of their own accord. My hands moved woodenly, typing with none of my usual rhythm or mistakes. The sensation was not painful but deeply unsettling, like being a passenger in my own body. I met Thomas Caldwell at a town social in June of 1912. My father had always kept me sheltered, rarely allowing me to attend such functions, but Eleanor had convinced him that at 22 I should be permitted some society. Thomas was handsome, intelligent, and kind. He had been educated at Boston College and returned to help run his father's lumber business. We danced only once that evening, but it was enough to change my life forever. My father had made his prejudices clear over the years. No Catholic would ever be good enough for his daughter, especially not an Irish Catholic from a family he considered beneath ours. I knew any attachment to Thomas would be forbidden, so we arranged to meet in secret. Eleanor discovered us and became our ally, helping to arrange meetings and carrying letters between us. We fell deeply in love that summer. In September, Thomas asked me to marry him. We knew my father would never consent. So on November 15th, we traveled to Westmoreland County with Eleanor's cousin as our witness, and were married by a justice of the peace. I continued to live at home, planning our escape to Oregon, where Thomas's family had timber interests and where we could live openly as husband and wife. In late November, I discovered I was with child. We decided to accelerate our plans to leave, but before we could do so, my father intercepted one of Thomas's letters. The confrontation was violent. My father struck me, called me terrible names, and swore he would never allow his grandchild to be raised by Irish papist trash. He confined me to the house, telling everyone I had gone to stay with relatives in Boston. Only Eleanor showed me any kindness during those dark months. As my time grew near, I became increasingly desperate. I had received no word from Thomas, despite my attempts to get messages to him. Unknown to me then, my father had arranged for Thomas to be offered a management position at his family's Oregon timber operation, a position too good to refuse. Thomas had no idea I was carrying his child. He believed I had gone to Boston as everyone was told, and that I would join him in Oregon when I returned. My daughter was born on April 10, 1913. I named her Grace Elizabeth Caldwell. She was small but perfect, with Thomas's dark hair and my blue eyes. For one night, I knew the joy of holding my child in my arms. The next morning, when I awoke from an exhausted sleep, she was gone. My father told me she had died in the night, that she had been too premature, too weak to survive. I didn't believe him. I heard a baby crying in the house, distant but unmistakable. When I begged to see her body, to hold her one last time, he sedated me. For days I drifted in and out of consciousness, trapped in a nightmare of grief. During a moment of clarity, I convinced Eleanor to help me search the house. She believed the baby had been sent away to another family, but I knew my child was still in the house. I could feel her presence, hear her cries in the night. Eleanor thought it was my grief driving me to madness, but she helped me nonetheless. We searched for 3 days, taking advantage of times when my father was at his practice and my mother was occupied with her social calls. On the third day, April 30th, I heard the crying coming from the attic. I climbed the stairs alone while Eleanor kept watch. In a far corner, beneath a loose floorboard, I found my daughter. She was already dead, wrapped in her christening gown. She had been hidden there like something shameful, left to die alone in the dark. The discovery broke something in me. I took her small body in my arms and wept until I had no tears left. That night, I confronted my father. The things he said, that no child of mixed blood would inherit the Harmon name or fortune, that he had done what was necessary to preserve our family's standing, revealed a monster wearing a respected doctor's face. He showed no remorse, only anger that I had discovered his deed. When I threatened to expose him, to go to the authorities, he struck me again and locked me in my room. I knew then that I would never be free, that he would keep me prisoner rather than risk his reputation. I had lost Thomas, lost my daughter, lost any hope for the future. At midnight, when the house was silent, I picked the lock on my door using a hairpin as Thomas had once shown me. I took poison from my father's medical bag, a large dose of laudanum mixed with morphine that he kept for his patients with terminal conditions. I wanted to die in the place where I had last felt hope, the staircase landing where I had waited night after night, watching for Thomas, believing someday he would come for me. The pocket watch he had given me, which I had kept hidden from my father, showed 2:17 a.m. when the darkness finally took me. I never knew that Thomas had received Eleanor's letter, that he had come for me only hours after my death. I never knew that he drowned, or was drowned, days later. These things I learned only after death, when time no longer moved in a straight line, and I could see what had happened before and what came after. For more than 100 years, I have walked these stairs, reliving my last moments, searching for my daughter and my husband. I watched Eleanor and Edward flee this house, taking their secret knowledge with them. I watched my father die in his sleep, unpunished for his crimes. I watched generations of my family live and die, none of them knowing the truth buried in these walls, until you came. You, who shares my blood, who sleeps in the room where I gave birth, who has compassion instead of fear. You can set us free, me, Thomas, our daughter Grace. Find Thomas's body. Reunite us all in consecrated ground. Tell our story so we are not forgotten. This is all I ask. The typing stopped abruptly, my hands falling limp onto the keyboard. The icy presence receded, and I gasped, flexing my fingers to restore circulation. When I looked up, the shadow stood before me, more defined than ever. I could almost make out facial features, the sad eyes of a young woman who had suffered unimaginable loss. "I'll help you," I promised, my voice breaking. "I'll find Thomas. I'll make sure you're all properly buried together. I'll tell your story." The shadow inclined her head in what seemed like gratitude, then slowly faded from view, leaving me alone with her written testimony on my screen and the weight of a century-old promise on my shoulders. The task ahead would not be easy. I would need to convince authorities to search for Thomas Caldwell's remains, based on little more than a ghost story and century-old documents. I would need to explain the infant bones in my attic without sounding like a lunatic or implicating myself in some crime. I would need to navigate the legal and ethical complications of disinterring Margaret from the family plot to reunite her with her husband and child. But as I sat there in the silent house, reading and rereading Margaret's account, I knew I had no choice. For the first time since my divorce, I felt a sense of purpose, a mission that transcended my own problems and connected me to something larger than myself. Margaret and Thomas had been robbed of their life together. Their daughter had been robbed of any life at all. I couldn't undo those wrongs, but I could fulfill Margaret's final wish. I could bring them together in death, give them the peace they had been denied in life. As dawn broke over the old Victorian house, I began making plans. The shadow on the stairs had found its voice at last, and I would make sure the world heard its story. Morning found me exhausted but determined. I printed Margaret's testimony, along with scans of Eleanor's diary entries and Thomas's letters. I photographed the locket, the pocket watch, and the marriage certificate. I organized everything in a binder, creating a coherent timeline of events. If I was going to convince anyone to help me, I would need to present the evidence as logically as possible. My first call was to Dr. Amelia Chen, a forensic anthropologist at the State University whom I'd met during a workplace safety seminar at the hospital. We weren't friends exactly, but we'd spoken at length about her work, and she'd given me her card with an invitation to call if I ever needed her expertise. I doubted she'd anticipated this particular request. "Michael Harmon," she said when she answered. "This is unexpected. How can I help you?" I took a deep breath. I have a somewhat unusual situation involving human remains on my property. Before I contact the authorities, I wanted to consult with someone who might understand the historical context. A pause. "Go on." "I found what appear to be infant remains in the attic of my house, probably dating to 1913. I also have documentation suggesting a murder-suicide occurred related to these remains. I need advice on how to proceed." Another pause, longer this time. "Are you certain about the date and that these are human remains?" "Yes to both. I have a diary, letters, and other documentation confirming the time frame. As for the remains, they're small but unmistakably human. And you're calling me instead of the police because this isn't a recent crime. The perpetrators and victims have been dead for over a century. But I want to handle this correctly, both legally and ethically." Dr. Chen sighed. "I appreciate you reaching out. Historical remains fall into a gray area legally, especially when found on private property that's been in the same family. Tell me more about these documents you mentioned." I gave her a brief overview of Eleanor's diary, the marriage certificate, and Thomas's letters, careful to omit any mention of Margaret's ghost or her supernatural testimony. Some things were best left unexplained if I wanted to be taken seriously. "This sounds like a significant historical find," she said, her professional interest clearly piqued. "Here's what I suggest. I'll come to your house this afternoon with a colleague from the history department who specializes in early 20th century social history. We'll examine what you've found and advise you on next steps. Don't disturb anything further until we arrive." "Thank you," I said, relief washing over me. "I'll be here all day." After hanging up, I called in sick to work for a second night. This couldn't wait. Dr. Chen arrived at 2 p.m. with Dr. Martin Abernathy, a thin, bespectacled man with an impressive beard and the intense demeanor of someone who lived more in the past than the present. I led them to the dining room where I'd arranged all the documentary evidence. Before we look at the remains, I said, I'd like to show you what I've discovered about the history. Dr. Abernathy pounced on Eleanor's diary, handling it with reverent care. Extraordinary, he murmured, examining the binding. This is definitely period appropriate. Where did you find it? Hidden compartment in a desk in the attic, I explained. Along with this, I showed him the locket. For the next hour, both professors examined the materials, occasionally exchanging meaningful glances or whispered comments. Dr. Abernathy took careful photographs of each page of the diary with a special camera he'd brought for the purpose. Dr. Chen focused on the marriage certificate and official documents. Finally, Dr. Chen looked up. These appear genuine. The paper, ink, and writing styles are consistent with the period. Now about the remains. I led them to the attic, pointing out the loosened floorboard where I'd found the small bones. Dr. Chen knelt beside the opening, producing a small flashlight and a pair of tweezers from her bag. "May I?" she asked. I nodded, stepping back to give her room. She worked methodically, examining the space without disturbing its contents. "These are indeed human infant remains," she confirmed after several minutes. "Based on decomposition and the materials present, they're consistent with the time frame in your documents. This child was likely only days old when it died." "Her name was Grace," I said quietly. "Grace Elizabeth Caldwell." Dr. Chen glanced at me, her expression softening slightly. "Yes, according to your documents." She turned to Dr. Abernathy. "What do you think, Martin? This aligns with the account in the diary?" The historian nodded gravely. Infanticide and concealed births were more common than people realize in that era, especially in cases of inappropriate relationships across class or religious lines. The doctor's actions, while horrific, wouldn't have been unprecedented among men of his status and time. "So what now?" I asked. "Do I need to report this to the police?" Dr. Chen straightened up. "Yes, but don't worry. I'll call a detective I work with regularly on historical cases. We'll handle this properly." She hesitated. "You mentioned something about a murder-suicide. The infant explains one death, but what about the others?" I showed them back to the dining room and indicated the relevant diary entries about Margaret's death and Thomas's drowning. According to these accounts, Margaret Harmon took her own life after discovering her baby's body, and Thomas Caldwell either drowned accidentally or was murdered shortly afterward, I explained. Margaret is buried in the family plot behind this house. Thomas's body was found in the river, but I don't know where he was buried. Dr. Abernathy leafed through his notes. If he was Catholic, he would likely have been buried in St. Patrick's Cemetery. It was the only Catholic cemetery in this area at that time. As for Margaret, he frowned. If her death was by suicide and if her father was as controlling as these accounts suggest, he might have concealed that fact to avoid the stigma. Suicide victims were often denied burial in consecrated ground. "Which means she might be buried on the property, but not in the family plot as recorded," Dr. Chen mused. "Exactly what I was thinking," I agreed. "And there's one more thing." I showed them the pocket watch, frozen at 2:17. "I believe this belonged to Thomas. It was among his papers in a box buried in my basement." Dr. Chen examined the watch carefully. The inscription confirms it was a gift from Margaret. The fact that it stopped at a specific time could be significant. In the Victorian era, people often noted the exact time of death by stopping watches or clocks. 2:17 a.m., I said. The time Margaret died on the stairs, according to what I've pieced together. Dr. Chen made the call to her police contact, explaining the situation with the clinical precision I'd expected from her. Within an hour, Detective Laura Reeves arrived, a no-nonsense woman in her 50s with silver-streaked dark hair and eyes that missed nothing. I repeated my explanation, showing her all the evidence I'd gathered. She took detailed notes and photographs, occasionally asking clarifying questions. Normally, the discovery of human remains would trigger a full criminal investigation, she explained when I'd finished. But given the age of these remains and the documentation you've provided, this falls more under historical recovery than current crime. I'll file a report, and we'll need to follow proper procedures for the removal and examination of the infant's remains, but you won't be treated as a suspect in any way." Relief washed over me. Thank you. I just want to do right by them, by all of them. Margaret, Thomas, and their daughter deserve to rest in peace together. Detective Reeves studied me curiously. "You seem very personally invested in this family history, Mr. Harmon." I chose my words carefully. "They're my ancestors. Their story was hidden, their lives ended tragically, and no one ever knew the truth or tried to make it right. I feel a responsibility to them." She nodded, apparently satisfied with my answer. "We'll need a few days to process everything and get the necessary permits. In the meantime, please don't disturb any of the sites we've discussed." After they left, the house felt eerily quiet. Night was falling, and I found myself drawn once again to the staircase, wondering if Margaret would appear at 217 as usual. Had our efforts today made any difference? Could she somehow know what we were trying to do? I dozed fitfully in the armchair I'd positioned at the foot of the stairs, waking just before the appointed time. 216, 217. Nothing happened. The staircase remained empty. A mixture of disappointment and hope washed over me. Had Margaret moved on now that her story was being told? Or was she simply waiting, watching to see if I would fulfill my promise? The next few days passed in a blur of official meetings and paperwork. Dr. Chen supervised the careful removal of Grace's remains, which were taken to her university laboratory for respectful examination and documentation. Detective Reeves obtained permits for a ground-penetrating radar survey of my backyard to determine if Margaret was indeed buried in the family plot as recorded. Meanwhile, Dr. Abernathy delved into church records, eventually confirming that Thomas Caldwell had been buried in St. Patrick's Cemetery in an unmarked grave. The final insult to a young man whose only crime had been loving across boundaries of religion and class. A week after my initial discovery, we had our answers. The ground-penetrating radar revealed that the grave marked as Margaret's in the family plot contained no human remains, just an empty coffin filled with sandbags to give it appropriate weight during the funeral. Dr. Chen's examination confirmed that baby Grace had died of exposure and neglect, not natural causes. And Dr. Abernathy had located Thomas's burial record, along with the exact location of his grave. I faced a choice. I could leave things as they were, having confirmed the historical truth, or I could take the next step and try to reunite Margaret, Thomas, and Grace as I had promised. The latter would involve more permits, more expense, more explanation to skeptical officials who wouldn't understand my commitment to a century-old tragedy. There was no real choice. I had given my word. It took another 3 weeks of persistent effort. I hired an attorney specializing in historical burial cases. I petitioned the Catholic Church for permission to exhume Thomas's remains. I searched the house from top to bottom for Margaret's true burial place. I found her in the walled garden behind the house, beneath a stone bench inscribed with her name and the false death date. Dr. Harmon had buried his daughter in unconsecrated ground, denied her the dignity of a proper funeral, and constructed an elaborate lie to cover his crimes. The concrete pad beneath the bench was relatively new, poured in the 1950s, according to Dr. Chen's analysis, suggesting that someone in the intervening generation had discovered Margaret's actual burial place and tried to mark it in some small way without revealing the family secret. The exhumations were conducted with quiet dignity. Thomas's remains were moved from St. Patrick's Cemetery with the blessing of the current priest, a compassionate man who understood the historical injustice at play. Margaret's body was carefully removed from beneath the garden bench, and tiny Grace, her bones now properly cleaned and arranged by Dr. Chen's expert hands, was placed in a small white casket. I arranged for all three to be reburied together in Maplewood Cemetery, in a peaceful corner beneath an old oak tree. The headstone was simple but elegant: Margaret, Thomas, and Grace Caldwell, together in eternity. The morning of the reburial ceremony dawned clear and bright. I had expected to be alone with the minister I'd hired, but to my surprise, a small crowd had gathered at the cemetery. Dr. Chen and Dr. Abernathy were there, along with Detective Reeves. The elderly volunteer from the Historical Society had come, bringing several of her friends. Even my father had flown in from Arizona, standing awkwardly at the periphery with my mother, both of them looking uncomfortable but determined to show support. As the minister spoke words of comfort and reconciliation, I glanced around at these strangers who had been moved by a century-old love story, by the tragedy of lives cut short and a family torn apart by prejudice and pride. In their faces, I saw something I hadn't expected, not just sympathy, but a shared recognition of our common humanity, our vulnerability to forces larger than ourselves, and our ultimate hope for peace. After the ceremony, my father approached hesitantly. "I never knew the full story," he said, his voice gruff with emotion. "My father, your grandfather, told me there was something shameful in our family's past, something we didn't talk about. He said his father had done terrible things to protect the family name, but he never told me what they were." "Why didn't you want me to move into the house?" I asked. "Did you know it was haunted?" He shook his head. "Not exactly. I just knew there was something wrong about the place. Growing up, I always felt watched there, judged. I heard things sometimes, crying, footsteps on the stairs when no one was there. My mother said it was just an old house settling, but my father would get angry if I mentioned it, so eventually I stopped talking about it." "And you never tried to find out the truth?" "It was a different time, Michael. Family secrets stayed secret. We didn't have the internet or DNA tests or ground-penetrating radar, and maybe I was afraid of what I'd find." He looked toward the fresh graves. "You did a good thing here, better than any of us managed to do." That night, I returned to the empty house, emotionally drained but at peace. I had honored my promise to Margaret. I had righted a century-old wrong. I had brought a family together at last. As midnight approached, I found myself drawn once more to the staircase. I sat on the same step where Margaret had spent her final moments, waiting for Thomas, not knowing he would come just hours too late. At exactly 2:17 a.m., the air grew cold, but instead of the solitary shadow I had grown accustomed to, 3 figures materialized on the landing. Margaret, now clearly visible as a young woman in an Edwardian dress, a tall man with a handlebar mustache who could only be Thomas, and between them, holding their hands, the transparent form of a small child. They didn't speak, but Margaret smiled at me, a smile of such profound gratitude and peace that it brought tears to my eyes. Thomas nodded solemnly, one hand resting protectively on his daughter's shoulder. Then, as I watched, they turned and walked up the remaining stairs, fading with each step until they disappeared entirely at the top. I knew I would never see them again. Their unfinished business was complete. Their spirits were at rest. But in a strange way, I didn't feel abandoned. Instead, I felt as if something had been passed to me. Not a burden, but a gift. The gift of purpose, of connection to something larger than myself, of understanding that love persists beyond death and that wrongs can be righted even after a century of silence. The next day I returned to work at the hospital, slipping back into my routine with a new perspective. Life went on. The security system recorded no more unexplainable temperature drops. The staircase remained empty at 2:17 a.m. The house felt lighter somehow, as if a weight had been lifted from its very foundations. 2 months later, I received a letter from the Maplewood Historical Society, inviting me to present the story of Margaret and Thomas Caldwell at their annual history symposium. Dr. Abernathy had written a paper on the case, focusing on the social constraints and religious prejudices of the early 20th century. The society wanted me, as a descendant and the discoverer of the truth, to share the personal side of the story. I agreed immediately. Margaret had asked me to tell their story so they would not be forgotten, and I intended to honor that request for the rest of my life. As I prepared my presentation, I found myself thinking about the nature of hauntings. Most people assume ghosts are bound to places, houses, cemeteries, the sites of traumatic events. But my experience had taught me something different. Margaret had remained in my house not because she was trapped there, but because she was waiting for someone who would listen, who would care, who would act. Perhaps that's what all ghosts are doing, waiting for the living to remember them, to acknowledge their pain, to honor their unfinished business. Not to fear them, but to witness them. On the night before the symposium, I stood at the foot of my staircase, looking up at the now empty landing where I had first seen the shadow. I'll tell your story, I promised the silent house. I'll make sure no one forgets. And somewhere, beyond the veil that separates the living from the dead, I like to think Margaret, Thomas, and little Grace Caldwell were finally at peace, together for eternity, as they should have been in life. The shadow on the stairs was gone, but its legacy remained, in the lives it had touched, in the truth it had revealed, and in the healing it had brought to generations of a wounded family. And in me, forever changed by my encounter with a love that refused to die, that persisted beyond death, beyond time, beyond the grave itself. Some might not believe my story. They might attribute what happened to coincidence, to an overactive imagination, to the power of suggestion. But I know what I experienced. I know what I felt. And I know that sometimes the dead speak to us not to frighten us, but to remind us of what matters most: love, truth, justice, and the courage to fight for all three, no matter how much time has passed. So if you ever find yourself in an old house with a history of secrets, and if you ever sense a presence on the stairs, don't run, don't hide, listen. Because there might be a story waiting to be told, a wrong waiting to be righted, a heart waiting to be understood. Sometimes a shadow is just a shadow, but sometimes it's so much more.